The Fête gardens behind St. Swithin's had been trimmed to within an inch of virtue. Bunting tugged at the mild breeze. The brass band exercised its paws like a conscientious stomach, and the cake tent radiated the plump confidence of sugar in public. Mrs. Ivy Peck, treasurer of the Horticultural Society and scourge of imperfect icing, stood at the head of the judging table with a silver rosette poised between finger and thumb. She was about to award Best in Show to a lemon drizzle of such lacquered beauty that it seemed sinful to cut, when she reached for the cordial at her elbow, sipped and folded very neatly into the cloth as if the garden had pulled her down by the hem. The band clashed into silence. A child squealed. Someone dropped a sponge with the indecency of a grenade. In the first seconds, it was embarrassment. In the next, it became a scandal. The vicar began to say something helpful and changed his mind at dear. Mrs. Peck's hat rolled to the floor like a small, outraged boat. A wasp, innocent and available, circled into legend. "Wasp," declared the greengrocer at once. "I've said all week they're vicious this year." "Judgment follows pride," the verger breathed. "She mocked my marmalade last summer." "In my view, arsenic," said a pub regular, reverent with relish. "Health and safety will issue guidance," Councillor Dabb announced, not quite to anyone. "We are fully compliant." "Smells like almond," hissed Mrs. Pilbeam, "and not of the legal sort." Purbright reached the tent in that tranquility he kept for public catastrophe. Sergeant Love, pink with concern, shouldered through with the air of a man bringing an apology to a riot. The inspector knelt, felt at the wrist, and directed the nearest volunteer to draw the bunting tight so as to shade what the town did not need to see. He looked not at the face but at the table, at the trophy, the cutlery, the cordial, the terrible ease with which a joyful spread could become evidence. He touched nothing for a minute. Then, with a folded handkerchief, he lifted the cordial glass toward the light. A ring of condensation traced itself halfway down the bowl, precisely level, as if the glass had stood filled for some time before being moved. On the rim, a kiss of coral lipstick curled like a signature. Mrs. Peck's mouth, where her hatpin had tugged her veil, wore a shade nearer claret. He set the glass aside and glanced at the rosette fixed to the lemon drizzle. Its pin had been driven through twice, once true, once slightly higher, as if a first attempt had been corrected in haste. The bent pin held a glint of violet fondant, a color not represented anywhere on the table. "Sir," Love whispered, "do we call it poison?" "Later," Purbright said mildly. His eyes had gone to the card at the cake's edge. Entry 61, Mrs. Maisie Rook. Beyond it, lying lonely among crumbs, a second card face down. He turned it over, with the same handkerchief. Entry 58, Mrs. Ivy Peck. "Curious," he murmured. The treasurer had a cake of her own, and at the last minute decided not to admit it, or someone admitted it for her, in the wrong place. The crowd, obeying the physics of curiosity, compressed. The vicar appealed for space in the voice he reserved for parish council disputes. The brass band nursed its instruments like widows. Purbright took in the rest of the table at a glance. The cake knife, newly polished, but its handle smudged with castor sugar, although no one had cut anything. The silver trophy, damply ringed where some glass had been set upon its base. The paper schedule weighted by a vegetable marrow that looked like municipal policy, long, green, and determined. "Inspector," gasped Mrs. Fudge, arriving with a plate and an accusation, "Ivy would never wear coral." It clashes with sincerity. "Then the glass was not hers," Purbright said, "and if not hers, perhaps not intended for her." He let that settle with the grace of an unwelcome guest. Love scribbled, then went pinker. "But she drank it, sir." "People often drink what is put into their hands," Purbright said, "especially in public. Hospitality is our strongest narcotic." The gossip thickened like jam. Someone swore they had seen a stranger near the tent. Someone else claimed Mrs. Peck had argued in whispers with the secretary of the floral committee. A third insisted he had observed Councillor Dabb polishing the trophy as though wiping his conscience. The verger hovered, more at home with sin than with medicine. The band began, with brave futility, to play Jerusalem under its breath. Purbright's glance returned to the rosette. The violet smear on the pin prickled at him. He scanned the tent and found a small stand at the far end where a local icing enthusiast had been demonstrating piping roses onto biscuits. Violet, precisely the shade. A child's sleeve, recently scolded, wore the same hue. He followed the line back to the cake table and imagined a hand, sticky with pride, adjusting the rosette in a hurry, and thought, not murder, then, in the knife, but misdirection in the lapel. "Inspector," Love said, "might we have the glass sent in at once?" "We shall, and everything else with it," Purbright replied, gentle as water. "But note, before you pack it, the condensation marks 2 residences, the first where it waited, the second where it was drunk." He set the coral print beside the claret lip as if introducing them. 2 mouths, 2 decisions, only 1 sip. He stood, and for a moment his quiet voice drilled through the tent more cleanly than the vicar's. "When a village performs," he said, "truth does not hide behind hedges, Sergeant. It hides behind bunting." Love blinked, grateful for something quotable. "Yes, sir." A boy wriggled under the cordon with the invincibility of youth and tugged at Purbright's sleeve. "Mr. Sir, there's another card, under the table." Love retrieved it with tongs. It was a score card, neatly ruled, on which Lemon Drizzle, Rook, had scored a peremptory 10, and beneath it, Victoria Sponge, Peck, had been crossed out hard. The pencil used had a stumpy red tip sharpened with a knife. On the reverse, written hurriedly, a single word, swap. For a few seconds, the tent became brighter with speculation. "Favoritism," someone hissed. "She was awarding herself." "Conspiracy," another cried, happier. "The treasurer defrauds cakes." "Ivy would never," declared Mrs. Fudge, with the solid certainty of matrimonial contempt unencumbered by marriage. She loathed Victoria Sponge, called it the coward's cake. Purbright's look said, "So." He bagged the card. Love, by instinct, reached for Mrs. Peck's handbag to establish particulars. He froze, then lifted the flap with 2 fingers and produced a thick brown envelope marked "Tender Documents, Pavilion Repairs, Confidential." The council crest preened in the corner. Across the top, in Councillor Dabb's handwriting as legible as a brass band, a note, to be opened after prize-giving. The tent inhaled. Even the wasp seemed to pause. "That," Purbright said softly, "is not a cake recipe." Love stared, unnerved and delighted together. So the prize-giving was part of something else. She was about to announce, or to refuse to announce, Purbright said. He lifted his eyes to the doorway, where Councillor Dabb hovered, pale at last, for a reason. "And if one wished silence in a hurry, Sergeant, one might begin with a glass clearly labelled Judge, and a shade of lipstick no judge would wear. Did you spot what Purbright noticed? Comment below," the Fate's teenagers would have added, had they been permitted to narrate to their elders. As it was, the tent settled into the uneasy balance between curiosity and shame that passes in Flaxborough for reverence. The cordons around the cake tent held, but only because Purbright had ordered them strung with the firmness of rope rather than bunting. Flaxborough's citizens, denied entry, drifted in orbits around the lawn, carrying their scandal like parasols, part shield, part weapon. The brass band had attempted "Onward Christian Soldiers," then faltered when no one marched. At the far end of the green, the coconut shy was deserted, its coconuts staring in wooden bewilderment. The Fête, once a pageant of jam and propriety, had collapsed into knots of gossip. Purbright had installed himself in the committee tent, a canvas sanctuary where the air smelled of tea leaves and old decisions. Mrs. Peck's handbag, retrieved from beneath the cloth, sat unopened at his elbow. On the table lay the envelope marked "Tender Documents, Pavilion Repairs, Confidential," and beside it the curious scorecard with its hurried word, "Swap." Love hovered with the excitement of a man who wanted to declare a solution before the riddle had finished asking itself. "It's obvious, sir," he said, tapping the card with a blunt finger. Mrs. Peck swapped the entries to favor her own cake. Rook's lemon drizzle scored top marks, but she meant her Victoria sponge to wear the rosette. She crossed it out when she saw she might be caught. She was trying to cheat. Purbright regarded him mildly. "Cheating in sponge is not quite the same as drinking poison, Sergeant. Besides, observe the pencil strokes. Sharp at first, then blunter, angled differently. The crossing out was done by a different hand in a different hurry." Love frowned, leaned closer, then colored. "So someone else wrote the word swap?" "Precisely. A command, not a confession." Before they could say more, Councillor Dabb pushed into the tent with the authority of a man whose conscience had already been dragged across the lawn. His hair lay flatter than his smile. "Inspector, this is intolerable. A fete designed for harmony has been turned into a theatre of slander. I demand you return those documents immediately." Purbright tapped the envelope lightly, as though to test its weight. They were in Mrs. Peck's handbag. "You will understand, Councillor, that until her death is explained, everything she carried is of interest." "They are confidential," Dabb snapped. "Confidentiality," Purbright said, "is most persuasive when the owner of the papers is alive to defend it. For the present, they remain evidence." The councillor swelled, deflated, and swelled again. "She was about to announce the tender result, you know. A matter of great sensitivity. Pavilion repairs, not a trifling sum. She had the figures, the winner, all in that envelope. This tragedy has robbed us of clarity." Purbright's eyes moved no faster than leaves in a breeze. "And robbed you, perhaps, of a victory?" Dabb stiffened. "My firm was among the bidders. But I assure you, Inspector, I should not stoop to poisoning a treasurer over jam and sponge." "No," Purbright said softly. "But one might stoop to arranging that a rival's tender never be read aloud." Dabb opened his mouth, closed it, and muttered something about unfair suspicion before withdrawing into the sunshine, where suspicion already bloomed without his help. Love released a pent-up breath. "He's guilty enough for 3 murders, sir." "Guilt," Purbright observed, "is like flour. It settles on everyone in the tent. Our task is to discover who baked with it." Mrs. Rook, whose lemon drizzle had been crowned then stained by scandal, was the next to appear. She was a slight woman with a nervous laugh that rattled like teaspoons. "Ivy was a friend, Inspector. A very exacting friend. I never thought... Well, she did like to have her way, but to be struck down over a cake. What will people say?" "They have already begun to say it," Purbright replied. "Tell me, Mrs. Rook, did you notice anything unusual about the judging table?" She twisted her hands. "Only that my cake was not where I put it. I delivered it early, before the band tuned up. When I returned later, it was 2 places down the table. I thought perhaps they had rearranged things for appearance. Or for substitution," Purbright murmured. "Did you touch the rosette yourself?" She shook her head quickly. "No, Inspector. Ivy insisted on pinning it herself. She said the ribbon should fall a certain way for the photograph." Her eyes filled with tears, though whether for her friend or her cake's reputation it was hard to judge. "Please, do you think she was poisoned?" Love leapt in with authority he did not quite own. "We can't say yet, madam." Purbright's gaze drifted back to the glass, its coral stain still vivid. "But we can say the glass was prepared before it reached her hand. That is not an accident, but an intention." Mrs. Rook paled and excused herself, clutching her apron as though it were armor. By late afternoon, the Fête field looked like a battlefield where gossip had triumphed. The hoopla stall lay abandoned, the tombola collapsed under the weight of innuendo. A child carried off a coconut without paying. No one stopped him. The Fête queen, still crowned, sat forgotten beside the duck pond, her smile congealed. Purbright stepped out of the tent and looked across the lawn. The vicar conferred with the verger in anxious tones. Councillor Dabb gestured grandly to a small knot of listeners, protesting innocence. Mrs. Rook spoke in whispers to Mrs. Pilbeam, who nodded as though sharpening her teeth. And hovering always at the edge, like a shadow without a body, stood a figure in a wide-brimmed hat and veil, gloved hands folded. Each time Purbright turned his head, the figure turned away, strolling to another corner of the lawn. Love followed his gaze. "That's the third time I've seen her. Shall I?" "No," Purbright said. "Veils are meant to be noticed. Better to let her think she hides." As dusk drew on, Purbright walked once more to the cake tent, now emptied of spectators, but thick with the sweetness of abandoned sponge. He studied the table, the faint drag marks where plates had been shifted, the marrows on the paper schedule, the bent rosette pin with its violet smear. Then he glanced to the grass beneath. There, half-trodden, lay a stub of red pencil sharpened with a knife, its point blunted with recent use. He lifted it carefully. "The same pencil that scored the card," he said. "Our author left their quill behind." Love brightened. "So we can trace it, sir. See who carried a red pencil." "In Flaxborough," Purbright said with a sigh. "Half the town carries pencils for committees and raffles. But few sharpen them with knives. That is the habit of someone who values improvisation over order." He pocketed the pencil. Outside, the lamps strung along the Fête field blinked into life, their glow trembling on bunting that now hung slack, like a banner's after defeat. The laughter had faded, replaced by mutters heavy as dusk. Purbright looked across at Sergeant Love, who waited with his notebook open and his certainty frayed. "Sergeant," he said gently, "the clue is not in which cake won, but in who wished the judging silenced. We must follow the tender, not the sponge." Love nodded, chastened. "Yes, sir." The inspector glanced once more at the tent, at the lipstick print that did not belong, at the coral shade no treasurer would wear, at the card scrawled swap in a hand that pressed for speed rather than neatness. He let the pieces rest in his mind, like cakes cooling on a rack, waiting to be cut. The doctor gave his verdict with the unhelpful caution of men who dislike making history at Fête. Mrs. Peck was dead. The cause was to be determined. There was a faint almond in the air, yes, but with a cake tent full of extracts, one might as well accuse the aroma of being an accessory. The cordial glass was taken away in a case that made it look indecent. The crowd, reassured by procedure, if not by truth, thinned into groups that spoke in lower voices but at greater length. Purbright returned to the committee tent and at last opened Mrs. Peck's handbag. He did it like a courteous burglar, every item placed where memory could find it again. A compact, claret, not coral, a purse, a string-bound notebook of subscriptions, a stubby penknife with traces of red lead in its hinge, and, folded into a smaller pocket, a program of the day's events annotated in crisp managerial strokes. Prize giving 3 o'clock. Announced tender after hymns. Band. Trophy Center. Mrs. Rook. Photo. Rosette angle. Above these notes, pressed into the paper like a watermark, a faint circle where a wet glass had rested. He held the program against the confidential envelope and found the same ring on its flap. "Someone used the envelope as a tray," he murmured. Love grimaced. Dabb, with his grand gestures. He planted the glass by the trophy to look official. Perhaps, though the glass wore coral and the schedule wears claret. Lips are less obedient than committees. He slit the evidence envelope with a paper knife and lifted out the tenders. 4 typed bids, 1 handwritten, all for pavilion repairs. Ellsworthy and Son, sober figures, 10% contingency. Dab and Company, confident, a flourish on the pound sign. Rook and Son, thin paper, late stamp over-inked. And Market Dern Building, careful arithmetic, modest profit. The 5th was curious, a single sheet offering a very low figure in consideration of community spirit. Signed, Flaxborough Improvement League. Love peered as if expecting it to confess under gaze alone. A league, he said. We have no league. We have dozens, Purbright replied. They form to object to whatever the council proposes, then disband. When the weather turns. He held the sheet to the light. The type impression was shallow, a ribbon tired of work. Not filed from an office, somewhere with a tired machine, perhaps a church vestry or a school cupboard. Love brightened, so the vestry again. Or any place where charity threatens efficiency. Purbright laid the bids in order and noticed the smallest betrayal. A faint dusting of fine white on the topmost page, as if the envelope had sat under plaster dust. He looked out at the green where the pavilion sulked beyond the shrubbery, its peeling paint promising workmen a living. We should ask the pavilion what it remembers, he said. The caretaker, Mr. Bullen, possessed the grim authority of a man who has wrestled with leaks longer than with people. He showed them the rot with relish and the cracks with an air of prophecy fulfilled. On a bench by the door, a smear of violet icing had dried into the grain. Kids, he said succinctly. They'll smear a cathedral if you give them time. The floral lot was in and out, bringing spare tables through here, and her... He jerked his chin toward a moral concept that stood for Mrs. Peck. She came by just after 2 to check the bunting, said we mustn't let the trophy wobble in photographs. Did she set anything down? Purbright asked. Only her handbag, twice, Bullen said. And a glass when some helper pressed it into her hand. She didn't drink. Said cordial, muddies the palate. She had a way with palates. Who brought the glass? Bullen scratched his ear. Veiled woman, hat like a saucer. Said she was sent from the cake tent. I thought she was from the vicar's wives. If he's got more than one, I'm against it. Left as soft as she came. On the way back across the lawn, Love's notebook scratched with hungry ticks. Veil again, he said, half to the page. Everywhere and no face to it. Could be anyone. Or everyone. Veils, Purbright said, are invitations to imagine a culprit you already dislike. They save the trouble of seeing. From the icing stand, the demonstrator, Miss Dawn Clipstone, a woman whose piping bags were arranged with the reverence other people reserve for reliquaries, watched their approach as one watches a draft near sugar work. She declared herself appalled, persecuted, and not at all surprised. Persecuted? Love echoed. By taste, she said. Mrs. Peck once called my violet theatrical. If there is theatre, it is not on my biscuits. She glanced at the rosette on the lemon drizzle as if it had offended her lines of symmetry. I piped all afternoon. If violet appears on some pin, it came there by enthusiasm. Everyone leaned. Do you carry a red pencil? Purbright asked. Of course, she said, producing one as if it might serve as an alibi. It was long, with a decent point, sharpened with a small metal sharpener attached by a string. I am not a savage, Inspector. Your consolation moves me, he said. Did you lend coral lipstick to anyone? She frowned at the irrelevance. To the Fête Queen. The committee issued a vile pink that made her look seasick. I gave her coral carnival from my handbag. She returned it with thanks and a smudge on my sleeve. She showed the faint residue as if it were proof of civilization. Then the coral may have belonged to her, Love said, pleased. The glass wasn't Ivy's. It was the Queen's. And the Queen was made to present it, Purbright murmured. He crossed the lawn to the duck pond where the queen sat with a guard of bridesmaids in grief. She confessed at once, like a good queen. "They said it would be nicer for the photograph if I carried the glass," she said. "A lady with a veil told me so. Take it to the judge and smile," she said. So I took it to the judge and smiled. I never drink at Fête. Lemonade makes me belch. "Prudence is underrated," Purbright said. "Did the veiled lady say who sent her?" "She said it was from the committee," the Queen replied, "and that timing was important. 3 o'clock when the band finished Jerusalem. But they played it twice because the trombone had a sulk. There lay a small hinge in the day. The bandmaster confirmed the repetition with wounded dignity. "We repeated the final verse to regain momentum," he said. "There was a disturbance near the tombola. Some child with a coconut. I signaled the lads and we blew." "So the prize-giving moved by a verse," Purbright said to Love later. "Our timetable slipped. A careful plan had to flex, or fail." In the lull that followed, Purbright allowed himself an investigation board in the privacy of his head. He had a glass prepared with coral that belonged to the Queen, a veiled messenger delivering it at a queue, a rosette pin carrying violet from enthusiasm, not malice, a scorecard altered by a red pencil sharpened with a knife, tender papers dusted with plaster and ringed by a wet glass, a program marked for an announcement after hymns. He lacked only the author of such domestic theatre. "Sir," Love ventured, "Mrs. Rook's husband has a firm in the tenders. If Mrs. Peck meant to announce a different winner, wouldn't Mrs. Rook have an interest in delaying the announcement?" And she had red pencil shavings. Look, on her apron hem. "Several women here have aprons. All have hems," Purbright said. "And if she wished to delay an announcement, she could simply mislay a key. Murder is poor admin." Even so, he spoke to Mr. Rook, a man of goodwill and bad suits. Rook admitted his bid was late. "Traffic," he said, meaning dithering. "Mrs. Peck told me she couldn't consider it, but she would speak for small firms when the council debated. She wasn't unkind, she was exact." Exactness, Purbright reflected, was a leveler. It made enemies of the lax and tools of the tidy. He returned to the committee tent to examine the envelope again and discovered, under the tenders, a sheet he had not first seen, folded into the lining as if hiding from the day. He teased it out with a paperclip. It was a check, newly written, payable to I. Peck Consultancy, signed with Councillor Dabb's assertive pen. The amount was substantial enough to improve anyone's opinion of a pavilion. Love made a noise somewhere between triumph and horror. "A bribe, sir." "A retainer, perhaps," Purbright said, "or gratitude promised in advance. The council clerk will tell us whether such payments are customary." He turned the check. A thumbprint smudged its corner faintly violet. "And here is our icing again, which does not travel on checks by prayer alone." He let the committee's silence bear the weight of that implication. Then he replaced the sheet among the tenders and closed the envelope as gently as one closes a hymn book after a verse that has gone wrong. Outside, the lamps trembled a little in the rising breeze. The veiled woman had vanished, or perhaps become 3 different ladies whose hats all knew how to be unhelpful. The Fête Queen had her coral back, less heroic now. Dabb spoke to a group of men whose faces had developed the cautious politeness of listeners considering the odds. Mrs. Pilbeam tugged at the vicar's sleeve to deliver a theory that would make him sorry for his cassock. Purbright paused at the tent door. "Sergeant," he said, "we have learned that the glass was meant for a photograph, not a thirst, that the timetable slipped, embarrassing whoever arranged the queue, that Mrs. Peck's handbag and the tenders were used as furniture, and that a check with a blush upon it hides in an envelope that should not have contained blushes. The question is no longer who baked the best cake, but who feared Mrs. Peck's mouth." "Dabb," Love said promptly. "Perhaps," Purbright allowed. "But fear has other shapes. There is also the fear of exposure, the fear of exactness, the fear of a timetable that arrives before persuasion is complete. Let us see whose voice trembles when asked the simple thing. He reached for the handbag to return it to its place and felt, beneath the lining, something brittle. He prized carefully and drew out a second card. Twin to the first, the knife-sharpened red leaving grooves deep as impatience. On it, in the same hurried hand, delay. By the following morning, the Fête ground bore the weary look of a battlefield after a skirmish. Flattened bunting, trodden grass, half-deflated balloons drifting like regrets across the lawn. The committee tent had been struck, but not before Purbright had made his inventory. Mrs. Peck's handbag sealed away, the cheque folded with the tenders, the penciled cards reading swap and delay, bagged like telegrams from some hasty war. The town itself, however, was not so easily tidied. Every shop, every parlour, every church pew hummed with theories. To half the townsfolk, Councillor Dabb had already poisoned Mrs. Peck. To the other half, she had poisoned herself in a fit of guilt over fiddling the cake scores. Only the verger, spreading piety with relish, declared it was the judgment of heaven for pride in drizzle. Purbright and Love had barely finished their first tea at the station when Constable Hallam rushed in, cheeks like lanterns. "Sir, pavilion, it's gone." They followed him at once, Love's pencil poised as if it might be called upon to draw ruins. The pavilion stood at the far end of the Fête Green, a structure that had looked tired for years, but never so tired as now. One corner had collapsed inward, scattering timbers and tiles like a drunken carpenter. Ropes still hung from yesterday's bunting, swaying above the debris as though applauding the destruction. At the centre, mercifully unoccupied but scandalously placed, lay the trestle table that had borne raffle prizes. Its hampers spilt apples and jam jars into the rubble like offerings. A crowd had gathered, naturally clucking and pointing. Mrs. Pilbeam was already instructing 3 women how the collapse had been timed to conceal the crime, while the verger muttered that dry rot was only another word for sin. Dabb, red-faced, announced that this proved the urgent need for his firm's repairs. The mayor nodded so violently that one feared his hat would topple. Purbright walked the perimeter, eyes low, noticing not the drama but the details. A plank sawn too cleanly to have snapped, a supporting beam whose nails gleamed bright rather than rusted, a heap of plaster dust far finer than the rubble could explain. He touched the dust to his fingers and sniffed. Lemon, faint, like polish. "The same signature," he murmured. Love crouched to sketch the beam. "Sabotage, sir. Someone cut through before the Fête, hoping it would fall. Maybe it was meant to kill Mrs. Peck instead of poison her. Or to end the announcement another way," Purbright said softly. "Collapse is as final as cordial." He stooped to examine the trestle table. Amid the spilt fruit was a card pinned beneath a jar of marmalade, now cracked but still clinging. He eased it free. In the same hurried, knife-sharpened red pencil, one word, silence. Love read it aloud, his eyes wide. "First swap, then delay, now silence. It's like a program." "Indeed," Purbright said. "A program written by someone rehearsing scenes. Swap the cakes, delay the band, silence the treasurer, and now collapse the stage." He folded the card into its envelope. The question is whether the author has reached the finale or only the interval. The constables roped off the pavilion. Dabb continued to harangue anyone who would listen about municipal negligence. Mrs. Rook, pale but upright, declared that her drizzle had been ruined by tragedy and that she would never bake again. The Fête Queen arrived, still, crowned though her smile had wilted, and confessed she had been told to stand near the pavilion for a ceremonial photograph. That never happened because the collapse came first. The veiled woman, she whispered, had given the instruction. Purbright walked the Queen back across the grass, speaking to her gently. "Did the veiled lady speak with an accent?" "No, Inspector. She sounded exactly like Mrs. Gribble when she tells the choir to stand straighter. Very firm. I thought perhaps it was her in disguise." "Perhaps," Purbright said, though his voice did not commit. At the station later, he arranged the cards on his desk. Swap, delay, silence. They looked like titles of hymns. He added the check, the coral glass, and the tender bids. Love hovered, waiting for revelation. "Consider, Sergeant," Purbright said at last. Each instruction required obedience. Someone to swap cakes, someone to delay music, someone to silence Mrs. Peck. These are not acts of solitary cunning. They are acts performed through others, willingly or not. Our culprit is a conductor, not a soloist. Love frowned. So half the town could be accomplices without knowing it? Precisely. Each one nudged into place like a pawn. The fete itself was the orchestra. The collapse of the pavilion is only the drum roll. That evening, Purbright took a solitary walk through the green. The lamps flickered on, illuminating the ruin. In the dust near the collapsed beam, he found another stub of red pencil, shorter than the last, sharpened roughly with the same penknife that lay in Mrs. Peck's bag. He turned it between finger and thumb, feeling the grooves of impatience. He slipped it into his pocket and let the night air settle the thoughts that stirred like moths around a lamp. Back at the station, Love waited, restless. "Well, sir, what do we do next?" Purbright laid the pencil stub beside the others. "We wait for the author to turn the page. A play this elaborate will not end without a finale. The next act will tell us more than guesses ever could." And indeed, in the pubs that night, wagers were placed on whose dignity would next collapse with the pavilion. The town, greedy for scandal, rehearsed its own lines, eager for the curtain to rise again. The morning paper appeared on doorsteps with an indecency usually reserved for gossip in church pews. "Fête tragedy. Treasurer dead. Pavilion collapses," it blared, the type large enough to carry across hedges. Beneath, a paragraph suggested police suspicion of foul play. No source was cited, but the town knew how little sources mattered. By the time Purbright walked across the square, the headline had already grown into a full indictment. According to Mrs. Pilbeam, Councillor Dabb had bribed Mrs. Peck and silenced her when she threatened to reveal it. By the butcher's reckoning, Mrs. Rook had poisoned her rival out of sponge envy. At the post office, the theory was more complex. The vicar had plotted with the Improvement League to shame the council into repairs. Each teller spoke with the calmness of a signed affidavit. At the station, Love was already waiting with news that gleamed like brass. "Sir, we've got him. Dabb. I knew it. A witness came in this morning, Miss Tansley from the council office. She swears she saw him slipping a glass toward Mrs. Peck just before the prize giving. Coral lipstick and all. Says she noticed because it clashed with her hat." Purbright set his hat aside, his expression unshaken. Convenient, is it not, that our loudest counsellor should be seen at exactly the moment we needed a villain? Love bristled. "But the cheque in her bag, sir. Proof enough, surely. He paid her. She was about to announce it." "Or about to refuse it," Purbright said gently. "A cheque can incriminate both the giver and the receiver, depending on the ink of hindsight. Did Miss Tansley recall what Mrs. Peck did with the glass?" "Drank it, naturally. Everyone saw. Yet Bullen swore she did not. She set it down. Our witness may have watched what she wished to see." Nevertheless, Dabb was brought in. He blustered, demanded lawyers, and accused half the town of conspiring against him. He admitted writing the cheque, but called it an advance consultancy fee, an investment in smoother negotiations. He denied poisoning her, denied moving the glass, and denied sharpening any pencil with a knife. His denial was so loud it became, paradoxically, almost persuasive. While he raged, Purbright examined his hands. Ink stains on the thumb, yes. A faint dusting of plaster on the cuff, as from the pavilion collapse. But no traces of sugar, no lemon polish, no red pencil. Dabb noticed the inspection and thrust his arms forward. "Search away, Inspector. You'll find nothing but honest sweat." Love whispered fiercely. "He's guilty, sir." "He must be. He had means, motive, and no silence," Purbright said softly. "A guilty man often grows quieter. This one cannot stop conducting." They released Dab under the cloud of suspicion. Outside, townsfolk watched him depart as though awaiting a confession written on his back. In the Black Swan, drinks were bought on the strength of his guilt. In the church hall, Mrs. Gribble led a whispered chorus about civic shame. The town wanted a culprit, and Dab fit like a glove, even if the glove was 2 sizes too large. That afternoon, Purbright and Love walked to Mrs. Rook's shop. She sat behind her counter among jars of barley sugar, her face pale and pinched. "I never wished Ivy harm," she said quickly before they had asked. "She was demanding, yes, but she meant no malice. My drizzle was moved. I swear I did not touch it." Love pressed. "Your husband's firm stood to gain if the tenders were delayed. Did you know she carried his late bid in her bag?" Her eyes widened. "I had no idea. My husband said it was rejected." She reached for her apron, twisting it. Red pencil shavings dusted the hem, unmistakable. Love pounced. "There, you've been using the same pencil that wrote the cards." She looked down in confusion. "Oh, Inspector, I sharpen with scissors. The shavings fall everywhere. I use it for pricing jars. Look." She rummaged and produced the stub. Its tip was neat, cut with steel scissors, not a knife. The point, while red, bore the tidy conical shape of a woman too busy to whittle. Purbright nodded. "This pencil sings in a different key, not our soloist." Even so, suspicion had now doubled. To the town, Mrs. Rook's apron was enough to convict her. Children whispered outside her window. A man muttered about sponge rivalry. By evening, her drizzle cake, unsold, had become a relic of disgrace. Returning to the station, Purbright found another delivery waiting. An envelope pushed under the door, containing a single scrap of blue paper torn from a wrapper. On it, again in red pencil, the hurried hand had written, "Confess." The stub had grown shorter with each note, the strokes more jagged. Whoever wrote them was running out of lead or patience. Love stared at it. "They want someone to take the blame, Dab or Rook. They're pushing us toward the wrong person." Purbright laid the scrap beside swap, delay, and silence. 4 words now. A litany. "Not confession, Sergeant. Cue. They're setting the scene for the next act. We have not yet reached the finale." The town, however, had already decided it wanted Dab pilloried and Mrs. Rook exiled. The false suspects had emerged, and with them the dangerous satisfaction of answers too easy. Purbright knew better. Plays with intervals this elaborate never ended before the curtain's true fall. By Sunday, the scandal had grown more elaborate than the fete itself. Mrs. Peck's death had become not simply a misfortune, but the opening act in a serial performance the whole town seemed eager to cast itself in. Suspicions turned hourly. In the morning, Dab was the villain. By midday, Mrs. Rook had been found guilty of sponge envy. By evening, the vicar was whispered to be part of a conspiracy involving hymn choices and pavilion rot. Purbright, walking through the square, noted that the town had developed the air of a theatre between acts. Every face rehearsing indignation, every mouth waiting for its cue. The cue came sooner than expected. The choir service at St. Swithin's had been intended as balm for the scandal, a pious interlude to remind the town of hymnody and order. Instead, it became the stage for the second great disruption. The nave was packed with townsfolk whose reverence had a curious lean toward spectacle. Candles burned, incense lifted, and the choir filed in with solemnity. Mrs. Gribble, stout and severe at the organ, struck the first chords of "All Things Bright and Beautiful" with a determination that suggested she intended to prove it. For the first 2 verses, order held. Then, as the third began, a strange sound intruded, a mechanical click, then a creak. heads turned upward. Above the chancel, the hymn board began to shuffle itself. Letters clattered, numbers slid, and suddenly the neat board displayed in stock figures the word confess. The gasp that followed drowned the choir. A woman screamed, a man dropped his hymnal. The organ faltered, then thundered on defiantly, but the word remained, painted by movable numbers arranged with a precision that belied chance. Confess. Love leapt to his feet. Sabotage, sir. Someone rigged the board. Sabotage? Purbright murmured. Or stagecraft. The timing is impeccable. He moved quickly down the aisle, the congregation parting in uneasy awe. At the base of the board, he examined the mechanism. The sliders had been tampered with, numbers rearranged into letters, their edges dusted faintly with red pencil, where someone had marked positions before slotting them in. Tucked into the ledge beneath, folded once, lay another scrap of blue wrapper. He eased it out. On it, in the same hurried hand, one word. End. The congregation buzzed like a hive. The verger muttered that the Lord's hand had moved the sliders. Mrs. Pilbeam loudly suggested dabs. Councillor Dabb himself, crimson with outrage, swore it was persecution. Purbright pocketed the wrapper and closed the board, restoring the numbers to hymns. Order, he said calmly, though the word carried more weight than the service itself. The choir resumed, voices shaky but obedient. Afterwards, outside in the churchyard, the theories swelled again. Mrs. Rook was accused of sneaking in to tamper with the board. The Fête Queen's veil was said to have been seen near the vestry. Mrs. Gribble, who had played through with ferocity, was whispered to have thundered accomplice chords. Love scribbled notes furiously, his suspicion darting from one to another like a swallow. "This proves it, sir," he insisted. "The author is mocking us now. Confess in church of all places. They want someone to break." "Or they want the town to demand it," Purbright said. "A confession wrung from pressure is as useful to theatre as to law, but theatre has its curtain calls. Our author has not finished." They walked into the vestry, where Purbright examined the hymn board more closely. On the shelf below it lay chalk dust and a stub of red pencil, cut with a knife. He held it beside the others, noting the diminishing length. "Our conductor is running out of lead," he murmured. Love frowned. "Then we must catch them before they run out of scenes." That afternoon, Purbright visited Mrs. Gribble at her house. She was still flushed from the service, her voice sharp. "An outrage, Inspector, to turn the house of God into a pantomime. Whoever it is, I hope you string them up with the bunting they disgrace." "Indeed," Purbright said. "But hymn boards do not arrange themselves. Someone had keys to the vestry." Her eyes narrowed. "Half the committee has keys. Peck, God rest her, had one. Dabb too, I'll wager. And young Miss Tansley, though she claims she never goes near the vestry. You'd do better to ask them than me." Purbright's gaze drifted to her sewing basket, where reels of thread lay, one coarse and grey. She noticed and snapped it shut. "I mend cassocks, that's all." Outside, Love whispered, "She's hiding something." "Did you see the thread?" "I saw it," Purbright said. "But thread is like motive. It lies in every household. What matters is who sews with it." Evening fell with the town still humming. The service had given them a new word to pass around their parlours, confess, and they used it lavishly. Some swore Mrs. Peck's ghost had moved the hymn board. Others insisted Dabb's bribe had been discovered and the dead woman sought vengeance from beyond. Children chalked the word on pavements. Dogs barked at it as though letters carried scent. At the station, Purbright placed the latest wrapper scrap beside the others. Swap, delay, silence, confess, end. It read now like a script. Love leaned over, his face tense. "Sir, it's building to something. First the cakes, then the collapse, now the church. Each act louder." What comes next? Curtain, Purbright said softly. The play will want its final act, but whether that means another death or only humiliation depends on how far the author believes the audience will follow. He turned the latest red pencil stub in his hand. Its point was gone, the wood splintered from impatience. The handwriting grows jagged. Our author is tiring, Sergeant. Fatigue breeds mistakes. We must be ready when it comes. As the lamps lit in the square, Flaxborough rehearsed again for the next scene, its citizens restless, their tongues sharp. They did not know it, but the curtain was already half raised on the next act, and the conductor's hand was trembling. By Monday, the scandal had ceased to be news and become atmosphere. It clung to the curtains in drawing rooms, wafted between counters in shops, and hovered above pints in the Swan. Children chalked "confess" on pavements until the council threatened to fine their parents for blasphemy in capitals. The Fête, long over, seemed still to be performing itself, each act adding another scene in the memory of the town. Purbright was not surprised when word reached him that the raffle draw, postponed out of decency, had been rescheduled with indecent eagerness. "Community morale," said the mayor with solemnity, though he looked as though morale tasted of jam and gin. The raffle was to be held in the town hall, its prizes transferred from the wrecked pavilion, its tickets already money in the coffers. To cancel it now would mean refunding, and refunds were a concept the committee found less tolerable than scandal. The hall filled with citizens dressed as though scandal were a gala. The hampers, freshly tied with ribbons, gleamed under gaslight. The numbers, chalked on a blackboard, awaited order. At the front stood Miss Tansley with her minute book, tidy as a hymn. Purbright and Love took seats at the back, their presence both reassurance and threat. The first prizes passed without incident, tea sets, vouchers, a hamper of fruit. Then came the grand consolation, a massive wicker basket stuffed with bottles and tins, its ribbon white as virtue. Miss Tansley announced the number crisply, 214. A ripple ran through the hall. The winning ticket belonged to none other than Councillor Dabb. Groans, mutters, accusations of fixing. Dabb strode forward with forced modesty, bowing and accepting the basket as though he carried civic responsibility. Then, as he untied the ribbon, a hush fell. Nestled among the bottles lay not only tins of peaches and packets of biscuits, but a folded pair of trousers. Not new, not wrapped, but unmistakably belonging to the mayor himself, his initials stitched into the waistband. Pinned to the pocket, in jagged red pencil, "Reveal." The hall erupted. Shouts, laughter, cries of shame. The mayor, stricken, lunged forward to seize the trousers, his face pale beneath his chain. Dabb dropped the basket, its tins rolling like loose change across the floor. Miss Tansley fainted neatly into her ledger. Love surged up, but Purbright merely raised a hand, his eyes steady. "Observe," he said quietly. On the waistband of the trousers, a smear of violet icing gleamed, faint but clear. The red pencil strokes were darker now, the stub having grown blunt. Purbright folded them carefully into an evidence bag. "Our author repeats themselves," he murmured. "Always trousers, always cue cards, always spectacles. It is not murder they desire, Sergeant, but theatre. Murder was the overture. Now they play variations." The mayor sputtered denials. Dabb bellowed accusations, and the crowd fed on the spectacle. In the confusion, Purbright saw again the veiled woman at the edge, standing very still, as if conducting the uproar with her silence. By the time he moved toward her, she had slipped out, leaving only the faintest scent of lemon polish. Back at the station, the evidence grew. Swap, delay, silence, confess, end, and now reveal. Love shook his head in exasperation. "Sir, they're taunting us. They won't stop until someone hangs for it. It must be Dabb. Why else would his number be drawn for the trousers?" "Because," Purbright said. He was the loudest audience. The louder the man, the more satisfying the humiliation. Our author is staging a morality play, and every counsellor is a character, but the hand with the pencil remains unseen. Love leaned on the desk. Then Mrs. Gribble. She conducts the choir. She loves timing. Everyone says her thread and pins go missing. Who else could arrange hymn boards and raffle baskets? Perhaps, Purbright allowed. But certainty is not. Reached by chorus. It waits in the wings until the actor steps forward. He turned the trousers inside out. In the pocket, he found not only the tag but a scrap of program, Mrs. Peck's program, torn from the margin, where her notes had been written. In faint ink, 3:15, announce. The edge bore a wet ring, as if a glass had once sat there. Purbright leaned back, his voice calm but edged. Our author had her program. They timed everything to it. Whoever handled her bag after she fell carried away her script and has been directing ever since. Love frowned, but the bag was in her possession when she collapsed. Precisely, Purbright said, which means the hand that reached to help her may have reached further. Outside, the town buzzed with fresh scandal. The trousers paraded in whispers. Dabbs swore revenge. The mayor demanded dignity, and Mrs. Pilbeam began collecting witness statements to write her own chronicle. And somewhere among them, the author sharpened the last of their pencil, preparing the next cue. The morning after the raffle scandal, the town hall smelled of spilt gin and bruised reputations. Councillor Dabbs' voice had carried well into the night, swelling from the Black Swan with promises of lawsuits, but the mayor's dignity had remained in the evidence bag alongside his trousers. The word reveal was still whispered like a hymn refrain across the high street. Purbright, seated at his desk with the cards fanned neatly before him, knew the theatre was approaching its final act. But before the curtain could rise again, he needed to understand not only who had been humiliated, but why each character had played their part in silence. He began with Mrs. Rook. She received them in her kitchen, where the lemon drizzle pan still stood on the draining board, untouched. Her eyes were rimmed from lack of sleep. "Inspector, I'm ruined," she said at once. "Everyone believes I tampered with the cakes. They whisper that I poisoned Ivy. Even children jeer as they pass. I cannot step outside." Purbright listened, hands folded. "You were friends with Mrs. Peck, yet you both entered cakes in the same competition. Was there rivalry?" "Rivalry?" Number she was a perfectionist. I bake for comfort. She advised me more than once. Harshly, yes, but she advised. She twisted her apron. It was my husband's business that concerned her. She said she'd press for small firms when the tenders were read. If she meant it, she was the only counsellor ever to do so. Love leaned in, his tone sharper. "And yet your apron bore red shavings. Your husband's bid was in her bag. That looks like more than a coincidence." Her eyes flashed, a brief rebellion. "If I had wanted to fix the tender, Inspector, do you think I would have submitted late?" "I had no control over that, and if I had wished her dead, I would not have been the first to drag her chair away when she fell. Ask anyone." "I tried to save her." Purbright inclined his head, noting both the bitterness and the sincerity. "Sometimes effort is mistaken for guilt," he said gently. Next they spoke with Councillor Dabb, who, in spite of his thunder, received them with the exhaustion of a man who had shouted his voice hoarse. He waved a hand at the pile of letters on his desk. Anonymous accusations, caricatures clipped from papers, envelopes scrawled, "Poisoner." "This is a persecution, Inspector," he said. "Yes, I paid her. Consultancy fee. She advised on costings. Nothing more. She was meant to announce my firm as the winner. Instead, she hesitated. Perhaps she meant to betray me. But I did not touch her glass." Purbright studied him carefully. "You had access to the vestry key, Councillor. Did you tamper with the hymn board?" Dabb flushed scarlet. "Nonsense. I was not near the vestry. I was with the band, ensuring order. Ask the trombonist." Love muttered. Ensuring volume, more like. Purbright ignored him. You shouted loudest after the trousers were found, almost as though you expected them. I expected nothing, Dab roared. They planted them to disgrace me. Peck's death is a tragedy, but what followed is theatre, and I am made a fool. His hands trembled, though whether with guilt or fury was difficult to read. From Dab's house they moved to the rectory, where the vicar awaited with troubled brow. He spoke of the hymn-board scandal with pastoral gloom. I feel complicit, he confessed. The vestry was left unlocked during preparations. I trusted too easily. Whoever moved the sliders knew our order of service well. Too well, he sighed. Mrs. Peck was precise. She often corrected me over announcements. Perhaps she knew something she should not. Love raised a brow. You think she was silenced by one of your own parishioners? I fear so. But confession, Inspector, is for the soul. You will require evidence. Purbright left him in thought, noting the tremor in his hands when he spoke of Mrs. Peck's interference. Even rectors dislike precision when it exposes disorder. Their last visit was to Mrs. Gribble. She sat amid her sewing, the basket open this time, reels of thread glinting like soldiers in neat rows. She greeted them with a severity that dared them to accuse her. The hymn-board disgrace was not mine. My organ playing is a sufficient contribution, but I will say this. Ivy Peck made enemies of every committee member by insisting on rules no one else cared for. She noted times, swapped order, delayed raffles, always her pen at the ready. She lived by the minute book and died by it. Purbright glanced at the basket. Among the reels lay the same coarse grey thread found on the trousers. You mend cassocks, yes? I mend anything the choir boys tear. Their knees are worse than their voices. And the red pencil? She drew one from the basket, sharpened with a knife, its shavings fresh. For marking hymns, is that now a crime? Love stiffened, triumphant. That matches our notes exactly. Mrs. Gribble smiled tightly. Then I suppose the entire choir is guilty. They borrow my pencil as they please. Inspector, you will find no choir without color. As they left, Love whispered, she's the one. Thread, pencil, choir timing. It's all her. Purbright's eyes narrowed. She fits too well. Our author arranges acts to humiliate the loudest. She knows that suspicion will fall on her sooner or later. Perhaps she counts on it. A scapegoat planted among her own props. That evening, back at the station, Purbright spread the portraits of character before him in his mind. Rook's bitterness, Dab's thunder, the vicar's tremor, Gribble's severity. Each held motive enough, yet each also held too much, as though painted deliberately to attract suspicion, and in the middle of them all lay Mrs. Peck's program, torn, ringed, penciled. Our author, he murmured, is not one of them alone. It is one who uses their habits as a costume, a mimic sergeant, someone who writes cues but never takes the stage. Love frowned. Then how do we catch a mimic? By waiting, Purbright said softly, until they stepped forward for applause. Outside, the town rehearsed again its lines of scandal, but in the shadows of the square, the veiled woman paused by the lamplight, watching. In her gloved hand gleamed the stub of a pencil, worn down to its final inch. By Tuesday, the scandal had grown teeth. It was no longer content to gnaw at reputations in private parlours. It strode openly through Flaxborough. The mayor, pale but obstinate, summoned an emergency council meeting to restore public confidence. The words themselves were an invitation to catastrophe, and Purbright, hearing them, knew the theatre was approaching its climax. He and Love took their places at the back of the town hall, the air already thick with argument. The councillors sat in a row like suspects, each face stiffened into innocence. Councillor Dab glared across the chamber, his cheeks mottled with indignation. Mrs. Rook sat quietly, hands folded, her apron hidden under a borrowed jacket. Mrs. Gribble loomed at the end, her knitting needles flashing like weapons between stitches. The mayor presided, his chain of office looking more like a shackle than an honor. The public had been admitted, of course. They filled the benches with the eagerness of theater-goers, whispering theories as if betting on outcomes. Mrs. Pilbeam had claimed the front row, notebook open, pen ready to record each scandalous syllable. The vicar sat behind her, eyes closed, perhaps in prayer or perhaps in dread of the inevitable. The mayor banged his gavel, but order was no longer a resident in Flaxborough. Dab rose, thundering. "This is persecution, pure and simple. I've been framed at every turn, first the check, then the trousers, then the raffle. Now, whispers of hymnboards and poison, I demand an investigation into those who would destroy the council itself." His words were greeted with murmurs, some sympathetic, more skeptical. Mrs. Gribble shot him a look that could have accompanied a dirge. "You brought disgrace by your own bluster, councillor. We have endured enough of your voice." "Better my voice than your silence," Dab snapped back. "A silence that hides too much." The mayor attempted to intervene, but his voice was drowned out by laughter from the public gallery. Love shifted uneasily. "It's breaking down, sir. This isn't a meeting. It's a stage." "Precisely," Purbright said softly. His gaze had already gone to the dais. Behind the mayor, where the agenda should have been pinned, a fresh sheet of blue paper now hung. The councillors had not noticed, but the crowd began to nudge one another, pointing. Words scrawled in jagged red pencil loomed above the mayor's head. "Justice." The gasp that followed was louder than the gavel. The mayor turned, saw the paper, and blanched. "Who dares?" he began, but his words were drowned in uproar. Shouts of "shame" and "resign" filled the hall. Someone banged a walking stick in rhythm, like a drum roll. Mrs. Pilbeam scribbled furiously, her pen scratching history faster than it could be lived. Love sprang forward to tear the paper down, but Purbright's hand restrained him. "Leave it," he said. "Watch instead." In the midst of the uproar, a figure rose from the back, veiled, gloved, unmistakable. The crowd fell into hush as she walked forward, each step measured as though she had rehearsed it. She paused at the center aisle, lifted her head slightly, and in a clear, deliberate voice said only, "Confess." The word rolled through the hall like a tide. The councillors shifted uneasily, the mayor's chain glinted in the gaslight. Dab, cornered, shouted again that he was innocent, that the real villain sat among them, that the council itself was rotten. Mrs. Rook began to weep quietly. Mrs. Gribble set down her knitting and folded her arms with grim satisfaction. Then, as if to complete the performance, the chandelier above the council table flickered, swung, and with a deliberate creak, released a shower of plaster dust. The councillors coughed, the mayor choked, the crowd screamed. When the dust cleared, another card lay on the table, as though it had dropped from the ceiling itself. Purbright retrieved it with his handkerchief, the word scrawled in that same blunted red pencil. Verdict. Chaos followed. The public surged forward, demanding resignations. The mayor clutched his chain as though it might save him from drowning. Councillor Dab roared over the din, pointing at Mrs. Gribble, accusing her of orchestrating the whole affair. She, with terrifying calm, declared that Dab had bribed, lied, and cheated, and that Ivy Peck had been ready to expose him. The vicar attempted to pray aloud, but was drowned out by laughter. Love looked at Purbright, his voice tense. "This is it, sir. They'll tear each other apart. We must act." Purbright studied the card, the pencil strokes growing ragged with each letter, the stub of lead close to extinction. He looked at the veiled woman, still standing in the aisle, her face unreadable. "Not yet," he murmured. "Our author is nearly out of lid. The last cue is about to be written. Only then will the truth step into the light." He folded the card, pocketed it, and raised his voice, calm but carrying. "Ladies and gentlemen, order." Justice is not written in pencil. It waits for ink. The hall stilled, if only from curiosity. The veiled woman slipped away, as always, into the shadows. But Purbright knew now that the end was near, that the theatre of humiliation could not sustain itself much longer without collapsing under its own weight. And when it did, the author would be revealed not by applause, but by mistake. The council meeting left Flaxborough as though a circus had passed through and pitched its tent in every parlour. By nightfall, the town was divided between those who thought Dab guilty beyond reprieve, those who saw Mrs. Gribble's stern silence as the true confession, and those who suspected the mayor himself of orchestrating the pantomime to divert attention from his trousers. Everywhere the word verdict was repeated with relish, as though the card found on the council table had been handed personally to each gossip. At the station, Purbright set the cards in order before him, a deck of stage directions. Swap, delay, silence, confess, end, reveal, justice, verdict. Love watched him with restless energy, scribbling notes that grew untidy with eagerness. It's closing in, sir. One more card and the whole plot will collapse. They're building to a final accusation. My money's still on Gribble. The pencil, the choir, the thread. It fits her as neat as a cassock. Purbright did not answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the pencil stubs, shorter now, almost spent. An author who delights in theatre does not end with silence, Sergeant. They end with spectacle. Our culprit has promised a curtain. The question is, where? That question was answered sooner than either expected. On Wednesday morning, the town awoke to find the church doors wide open, the bell tolling without hand on the rope, its notes cracked and uneven. By the time Purbright and Love arrived, half the town had already gathered in the churchyard, whispering and craning necks. Inside the nave, across the altar rail, lay another pair of trousers, this time belonging unmistakably to the vicar, his initials stitched with clerical care. Pinned to the waistband was the final card. Its letters, jagged and desperate, read, "Curtain." The congregation gasped as though an invisible hand had struck them. The vicar himself turned the colour of his surplice, stammering that he had no idea how his garment had left the rectory. Dab laughed aloud, cruel with relief. There, proof it was never me. A holy man's dignity stolen, who but Gribble could stoop so low? Mrs. Gribble, present with arms folded, retorted with thunder. You disgrace yourself, councillor. The vicar has long been careless. His laundry basket was seen by half the choir. Any hand might have plucked from it. The verger stepped forward, pale. Inspector, I saw a veiled woman enter the vestry last night. I thought she was part of the choir practice. She carried a parcel under her arm. When I asked, she said it was for the hymn board. I did not question further. Purbright lifted the trousers, studying the waistband. Once again, the coarse grey thread stitched a hurried seam. On the pocket, a faint smear of coral lipstick lingered, half rubbed away. He folded them into an evidence bag with the calm of a man adding the final piece to a jigsaw he had already completed in his head. The church buzzed with accusations. Some pointed to Dab, others to Gribble, a few even to the vicar himself, claiming self-humiliation to garner sympathy. Love, overwhelmed, leaned close. It can't be all of them, sir, and yet each clue fits more than one. How do we choose? We do not choose, Purbright said quietly. We observe who steps forward to claim the applause. That moment came swiftly. As the crowd surged with suspicion, the veiled woman appeared again at the aisle, this time striding boldly. She reached the altar steps and raised her hands for silence. The church, hungry for theatre, obeyed. Her voice, clear now, rang against the stone. Flaxborough is corrupt. You have seen your councillors exposed, your treasurer silenced, your mayor shamed, your vicar humbled. Justice has been written in red before your eyes. Who dares deny it? The crowd erupted in shouts of agreement. Dab blustered. The mayor groaned. The vicar bowed his head. Mrs. Gribble alone looked as though she had been expecting such a performance. Purbright stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying. "And yet, madam, justice does not arrive in pencil strokes and stolen garments. It arrives in truth. You have written many words, but not your own name." The veiled woman stiffened, her hand tightening on the stub of pencil she still carried. Love cried out, "She's the one, sir. Arrest her now." But Purbright shook his head. "Not yet. We must let her finish her play. The author will not leave the stage before the curtain truly falls." The woman faltered, then thrust the pencil high. "Then here is my confession. Flaxborough is rotten, and I'm the voice that will cleanse it." The crowd roared approval, but Purbright only watched, eyes narrowed, noting the tremor in her hand, the exhaustion in her stance, the smudge of violet icing on her glove. A mimic, he thought again. A conductor who borrowed props from every player. She had staged humiliation with trousers and hymn boards, with pencils and checks, but she had not yet revealed the hand behind the disguise. When she lowered the pencil at last, Purbright stepped forward. "Then the play is over, and the actor behind the veil will take her beau." The woman froze, then turned sharply toward the vestry door, but the constables were already there, blocking her exit. The crowd surged forward, craning to see her unveiled, and in that moment, with her hand shaking and the pencil dropping to the stone floor, Purbright knew the final misdirection had ended. The truth was ready to step forward. The church held its breath as the pencil clattered onto the flagstones and rolled, a small cylinder of lead worn down by obsession. The veiled woman stood motionless, her hand trembling where it had been raised in triumph. The constables closed in, their boots loud in the hush, but Purbright gestured them to wait. He walked forward himself, calm as a man approaching an altar, and stopped just short of the figure. "Enough theatre," he said gently. "The curtain has fallen. It is time to name the author." The woman hesitated, then raised her chin. Her gloved hands moved to her veil. A ripple ran through the crowd. When the fabric fell away, a gasp followed. It was not Mrs. Gribble, nor the Fate Queen, nor even Miss Tansley from the council office, as many had whispered. It was Miss Dawn Clipstone, the icing demonstrator whose piping bags had been admired, then forgotten amid the tumult. Her face, usually pale with concentration, now burned with fervor. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with a passion more desperate than defiant. "I wrote it, every word, swap, delay, silence, my script, and you all obeyed. You followed as sheep to the slaughter of truth. I gave you theatre because truth alone you would never hear." Love cried out in astonishment. "You? But why? What had Mrs. Peck done to you?" Miss Clipstone's eyes flashed. "She sneered at me, called my colours theatrical, my work frivolous. She ruled this town with her programme and her purse. She was about to let Dabb's greed destroy the pavilion, ignore the League's plea for fairness. She kept her rules in her bag, as if life could be ordered with pins and paper. And you—" She swept her gaze across the congregation. "You all let her. But I would not." Purbright's voice remained mild, but its steadiness cut through her fervor. "So you poisoned her glass." Clipstone shook her head fiercely. "Number I gave her no poison. I planned humiliation, not death. I placed coral on the rim so the queen would be blamed. I arranged the swap so her own cake would seem suspicious. I wrote delay so the band would stumble. I hung silence so she would be shamed. It was theatre, Inspector, not murder. Someone else put death in her drink." The murmur in the church swelled. For a moment, even Purbright allowed the words to settle. Then he nodded once. "You are right. You staged the play, but you were not alone on the stage. The poison belonged to another hand." The crowd shifted, hungry for more. Purbright lifted the evidence bag containing the check. Mrs. Peck carried this in her handbag, a consultancy fee from Councillor Dabb. She meant to reveal it publicly, to shame him, but she also carried the late bid from Mr. Rook's firm, promising to speak on its behalf. Too many promises, too much exactness. She was about to expose more than one. He looked at Dab, whose face was grey with sweat. Your check, counsellor, was her silence bought in advance. When she hesitated, you feared exposure. But you did not prepare the glass. He turned his gaze slowly. Mrs. Rook, you believed she might still discard your husband's bid. You had a motive, but no access to her program. And Mrs. Gribble, your pencil, yes. But your organ drowned her voice, not her breath. No, the hand that offered the cordial was another. The hand that moved easily among committee tables, that knew her bag, her notes, her program. Love leaned forward, scarcely breathing. Miss Tansley, Purbright said quietly. The secretary, you handled every paper, every envelope. You arranged every chair. You carried messages without notice. And you feared her most, for she saw through your tidy minutes to the disorder underneath. You poured cordial for her, pretending courtesy, and slipped a little more into the glass. Gasps broke from the benches. Miss Tansley, neat, precise, almost invisible at every meeting, now stood frozen, her lips parted in horror. That is a lie, she whispered, but her voice lacked its usual crispness. Purbright drew from his pocket the last stub of red pencil. Not a lie. Your pencil, sharpened with the knife you keep in your ledger drawer. Your handwriting on the cards, though disguised in haste, betrayed by the angle of your strokes. Miss Clipstone staged the scenes, but you wrote the cues that mattered most. You made sure Mrs. Peck would drink when she never drank, and you ensured her handbag contained the papers that would confuse suspicion. Poison was yours. Pageantry was hers. The crowd broke into uproar. Clipstone stared at Tansley with something like betrayal, then bitter laughter. I gave you drama, and you turned it into tragedy. You killed her and left me to take the bow. Tansley's neat composure cracked. Her hands shook, her voice rose. She humiliated me in every meeting, corrected every note. I was her servant with a ledger. She would never let me speak. I wanted only to stop her voice. Just once. Purbright nodded sadly. And so you silenced it forever. But silence written in poison speaks louder than truth. The constables stepped forward. Tansley collapsed into their arms, her resistance gone. Clipstone, still trembling, allowed herself to be led away too, her part in the conspiracy confessed. The crowd spilt into the churchyard, buzzing with revelation, eager to repeat every word, before they had even heard them all. Love exhaled, his shoulders sagging. So that's it, sir. 2 women, 1 playwright, 1 murderer. Purbright replaced the cards in their envelope, his tone as calm as ever. Theatre and truth are seldom far apart, Sergeant. Flaxborough applauded both. It will go on applauding long after this day is past. The church bells, silenced at last, stood still above them. The square filled again with gossip, but this time with the satisfied air of a play completed, its ending explained. Purbright, stepping into the sunlight, added only, "Case closed. The curtain has fallen." The end.